Hi, welcome everybody. My name is James Ley. I'm the editor of the Sydney Review of Books. This is Australian Literature 102, and I'm very pleased to have on stage with me today Michelle de Kretser. Now, Michelle, anything interesting happened to you in the last couple of months? Nothing particularly out of the ordinary. Michelle is, of course, I'm sure you all know who Michelle is. She's a novelist, author of 4 novels, The Rose Grower, The Hamilton Case, The Lost Dog, and, of course, most recently, Questions of Travel, among her numerous accolades. She recently won the Miles Franklin Award for Questions of Travel and the ALS Gold Medal. And Michelle is here today to talk to us about one of her favourite books, Shirley Hazzard's The Transit of Venus. So, without further ado.
Thank you. Begin by dropping my water. Thank you, James, and thank you to the Wheeler Centre for this opportunity. Shirley Hazzard was born in Sydney in 1931. In 1947, when she was 16, she travelled by ship to Japan and Hong Kong with her parents. She has made brief return visits to Australia, but has never settled here again. Most of her life has taken place in Europe and the United States, where she still lives. Keep in mind that voyage out, won't you? That shipboard journey made by a schoolgirl. I'll come back to it later on. The Transit of Venus, Hazzard's 3rd novel, was published in 1980. It won the Miles Franklin Award and the National Book Critics Circle Award in the States. It now has the status of a modern classic. Readers and writers across the world name it as a touchstone book and attest to the intensity of their engagement with Hazzard's text. My copy of it is falling apart from multiple readings, although it must be acknowledged that paperbacks published in the 1980s came apart even on the first reading. I don't know what they used for glue back in the day. So all I can hope to do this evening is to signal some of the ways in which I've found it rewarding to think about this remarkable and remarkably complex novel. Let's consider the title for a moment, The Transit of Venus. You'll remember that in June last year, Venus, passing between the Earth and the Sun, could be observed as a small black dot moving across the Sun's ruddy face. If you missed it, you won't have another chance to see it. Transits of Venus are among the rarest of predictable astronomical events. They occur in pairs, 8 years apart, with gaps of more than 100 years between each pair. The next pair of transits will take place in 2117 and 2125. You'll be aware that this rare phenomenon has a special significance for Australia. In 1769, Captain James Cook sailed to Tahiti to observe the transit from a site which is still known as Point Venus. And he went on, of course, to explore the coast of Australia and of New Zealand. So the founding of modern Australia is bound up with the transit of Venus. Venus, of course, is the Roman goddess of love and beauty. And Hazzard's narrator describes Caroline Bell, the beautiful young Australian woman who is one of the main characters in the novel, as a child of Venus, which I always think is a rather lovely way to think about ourselves as Australians. We are children of Venus. So there, already present in the title of this novel, are its significant elements: astronomy, love, history, pairs, travel, Australia, observation, and suffering, because, of course, Cook's voyage had catastrophic consequences for the indigenous people of this continent. So what I propose to do now is to examine the workings of 3 of these elements, using them as 3 lenses through which to view the novel. And I'll begin with pairs. As I mentioned, transits of Venus occur in pairs. And one of the patterns underlying Hazzard's narrative, and lending it great resonance, is the recurrence of oppositional pairs, characters and events that are contrasted with each other. The novel follows two Australian sisters, Caroline and Grace Bell, orphans who have immigrated to England in the 1950s, and it charts their very different experiences of love, work and marriage over the next 20 years. Caroline, Caro, is courted by two men, the faithful and loving Ted Tice and the faithless and selfish Paul Ivory. Ted is an astronomer, a scientist, and Paul is a playwright, an artist. Caro eventually marries Adam Vale, an American who works selflessly for international human rights. Grace, the more conventional sister, marries Christian Thrale, a self-serving civil servant in the British Foreign Office. And so on. There are dozens of these oppositional pairings in the text. Their function is to dramatise sharply contrasted values and behaviours. Let's look at two of these paired scenes. The first occurs in a long flashback to the Bell sisters' childhood in Sydney during the Second World War. Caro's school is evacuated to the country property of an Italo-Australian architect. The schoolgirls are told that, although Italian, he is on our side. And we might imagine the pressures on this man to prove his patriotism by offering his beautiful villa as housing for the school. Also on the property, where they work as farmhands, are several Italian prisoners of war. I'll quote the crucial bit. From the fields, or behind the wire, the prisoners waved to the schoolgirls, who never waved back. Never. It was a point of honour. The second scene is also narrated in flashback. Ted tells Caro about something that happened when he was at school in Wales, also during the war. The school is in the country and not far from a prisoner of war camp. One day the boys are told that a German officer has escaped. A week later, when Ted is out walking by himself, he runs into the officer. He sees that the man is exhausted and starving and gives him clothing and something to eat. Ted does this instinctively, without calculation. He sees another human being in need and does what he can for him. Of course, this is fraternizing with the enemy during wartime, so his kindness would be called treason in a court of law. It constitutes a crime. We're invited to contrast the righteousness of Caro and her friends, who have internalized the political division between us and them, friend and enemy, with the humanitarianism shown by Ted that simply cuts across those categories. After the war, Ted learns that the German was a scientist who managed to return to Germany, where he helped make weapons that later killed thousands of people. And Ted holds himself responsible for those deaths and wonders if he should have helped the German. But Caro says of what Ted did, anyone would think such an action rightful in a book. And she's right. We do feel that whatever the consequences of Ted's action, it was kind. Unlike the girls' prim response, or lack of response, with regard to the Italian prisoners. In fact, their refusal to respond to the men's friendly, perhaps flirtatious waving is a micro-instance of what makes war possible in the first place, namely a refusal to recognize the humanity of the other. As a young woman, Hazzard worked for the UN, an experience she found deeply disillusioning. She's written 2 non-fiction books about the UN. Defeat of an Ideal, the title says it all, and Countenance of Truth, both highly critical. Her experiences there also provided material for People in Glass Houses, an excellent, funny, and bleak collection of stories about a vast organisation called The Organisation, whose grand aims are ground down by small-minded, self-serving individuals. It's very characteristic of Hazzard's fiction to insist on the continuity between private and public morality, a view that pretty clearly arises from her time at the UN. We see it in The Transit of Venus, where an uncompromising distinction between honourable and dishonourable behaviour, between goodness and evil, is reminiscent of the strong moral grounding we find in 19th century fiction. Dickens is an obvious parallel. And in fact, he's referenced in The Transit, where the meeting between Ted and the German officer is compared to Pip's encounter with the convict in Great Expectations. When we first meet Caro, the narrator tells us that, I quote, "She would impose her crude belief that there could be heroism, excellence, on herself and others, until they or she gave in." I read this as a self-reflexive moment, for a belief in moral heroism and excellence is what Hazzard seeks to impose on readers of her novel. And I think the reason readers report such a strong engagement with The Transit of Venus is this ethical address. You can almost hear it, just below the narrative surface, exhorting us to be individually honourable in our dealings with others, if what we wish for is a just and compassionate world. So, from ways of being to ways of seeing. The second aspect of the novel that I want to talk about is observation. What do we do with the transit of Venus? We observe it. We might observe it on TV, or on a computer screen, or through a telescope, or, as I did last year, through those nerdy-looking protective glasses. And it was really after watching The Transit last year that I noticed how much emphasis Hazzard places on observation in this novel. At its simplest level of operation, this takes the form of pivotal scenes of observation. These scenes typically signal moments of heightened emotional and/or sexual connection. Moments when Venus might be said to transit a life. Ted first sees Caro standing at the top of a flight of stairs. He looks up at her, transfixed. She looks down at him and goes away. The scene sets the pattern for their relations. Ted enthralled, Caro elusive. Later, Paul arrives at the same house, and Caro and Grace see him through a window. Sun imagery surrounds Paul. He's light-haired, he shines, he has a handsome, fair, and fortunate face. Similarly, years later, Grace will fall in love with a man whose ruddy and golden tints are described as a blaze of midnight sun. These crucial moments of observation are often framed by windows. I've mentioned Grace and Caro looking at Paul through the window, and similarly, Caro and Adam, her first husband, first see each other through a window. Her future husband, she only marries once. The most striking window scene occurs when Caro and Paul have been making love in an upstairs room, and Paul's fiancée pulls up in a car on the drive below. Paul quickly puts on a shirt and goes to the window where he stands talking to his fiancée. Then Caro comes up and stands at his shoulder. The narrator tells us that she was wearing nothing but a small round watch. It is Caro now who is sunlight. Light strikes her bare shoulder and makes reddish streaks in her dark hair. The sun reveals things as they are, and by her action, Caro has revealed the truth of her relationship with Paul, who would prefer to conceal it. Moments passed or did not pass, writes Hazzard. And here, as in all these episodes, the momentum of the narrative slows and stills. They are highly visual, arrested scenes. They have the cinematic quality of freeze frames. They enable us to observe the characters, observing each other. This invitation to the reader to stand back and observe extends beyond these episodes. In fact, it pervades the novel. As I've said, Hazzard distinguishes sharply between characters who behave with integrity and those who don't. But the way the novel is written, its rhetoric, doesn't really encourage identification even with the sympathetic figures. Distance, a certain measure of distance, is always inserted between reader and character. One way Hazzard achieves this is by often using a character's full name: Caroline Bell, Adam Bale, Ted Tice, or even more formally, Edmund Tice. Sometimes characters we have come to know well are identified merely as the man, or the woman, or the girl. These devices remove us from the orbit of the characters. We observe them dispassionately, as an astronomer observes the stars. But actually, that analogy is one the novel problematizes. Speaking of a power-hungry fellow scientist, Ted remarks that there are those who see only what they wish to see, even through a telescope. And here we should remember those scenes framed by windows, and recognize that a view through a window is only a partial one. It doesn't show the whole picture. So these are ways in which the novel signals the limits of human understanding. Even what our most powerful scientific instruments can tell us is conditional on human interpretation, human subjectivity. If Ted sees people and situations accurately, it's not because he is a scientist, but because he's an outsider. He's a working-class boy from the Midlands, whose intelligence has gained him entry to the scientific establishment, but who remains removed from its corrupt workings. Again, we find that idea of distance enabling accurate observation. And of course, Caro, as an Australian, is an outsider in England and looks with a cool eye on the conservative upper-middle-class set to which she has gained access by virtue of her sister's marriage. Foreigners, women, the poor, those outside institutionalized power are well placed to perceive its workings, the workings of privilege. And Hazzard describes this clarity of vision as an Antipodean way of seeing. Ted has particularly acute Antipodean vision. It's symbolized by a streak in one of his eyes, the result of an old accident. That this man with a flawed eye should apprehend the world so clearly is one of the ironic reversals Hazzard offers her readers. Regretfully, I'm not going to have time to examine Hazzard's style in detail. Her sentences burst like small, bright shocks on the mind, and I would like to devote a whole lecture to them, actually, if I could, arguing that the perfection of Hazzard's prose is continuous with her moral vision, her belief in the need for integrity in everything we do. But having started that hare, I'll leave you to follow it. I do, however, want to draw attention to one aspect of style that relates to observation, and that is Hazzard's extensive use of irony. Irony underwrites the novel's humour, and it's a very witty novel, as well as a very sad one. Consider this skewing of a character. I quote, "Dora sat on a corner of the spread rug, longing to be assigned a task so she could resent it." I think we all know Dora. Ironic detail abounds. Take the rundown amusement park Ted and Caro see, at whose entrance a sign has lost its introductory F and reads, in consequence, unfair. Another way Hazzard generates irony is through close attention to language. She's especially fond of resurrecting dead metaphors to comic effect. An example. Christian Thrale was now rising in his profession. Those peering into the oven of his career would report, Christian is rising, as if he were a cake or a loaf of bread. What is notable about irony, however, is that it's a distancing trope. It encourages seeing through rather than seeing with. So once again, meshed into the novel's language, into its wit, is distance. Events and characters presented at arm's length for our scrutiny. And while I find The Transit of Venus an intensely moving novel, I also find it quite a chilling one. The narrative proceeds as if in the grip of an overpowering force towards its tragic ending. A tragedy prefigured in the novel's very first sentence, as if to suggest a predetermined outcome. And in a gesture of astonishing narrative bravado, we're informed in the first pages of this novel that Ted will take his own life in time to come. We spend the rest of the novel in fearful anticipation of this event, which, when it does happen, takes place off stage and is reported almost casually. The whole episode is one of the most brilliantly handled in literature. The point I want to make, though, is that by informing us in advance of Ted's suicide, Hazzard makes that tragic outcome seem given, inevitable. I can't read this novel without thinking of Thomas Hardy. And Hardy is mentioned in these pages because the transit shares the sense of inexorable fate, fate that is written in the stars, that is so characteristic of Hardy's fiction. And I'll note also in passing that coincidence plays a pivotal role in the transit, as so often in Hardy, once again reinforcing that idea of a power beyond human control. Like her great predecessor, Hazzard is both deeply compassionate and utterly unsentimental. That seems a good point at which to turn to the third and final aspect of the transit that I want to look at, and that is love. When The Transit of Venus was published in the States, the Viking Press, Hazzard's publisher, advertised it in the New York Times Book Review as a novel about changing hearts and deepening passions. In other words, whatever they really thought about the novel, they marketed it as romantic fiction. Here is the cover of my Australian edition of the book from the early 80s. Caro's dark hair is mentioned over and over again, which I suppose explains why the designer put a blonde on the cover. But I guess they have more fun, it's more romantic, whatever. In Australia, an eminent male reviewer dismissed the novel as, I quote, the best-dressed women's magazine fiction of the year. An eminent feminist reviewer agreed. claiming that it was very close to romantic fiction. Well, it's my belief that reviewers are so used to dealing with molehills that they often have no idea what to do with a mountain. Although, in deference to James, who is, of course, one of our best reviewers, I should also say that many critics recognised and hailed the power and originality of Hazzard's novel. Now that time has lent Antipodean clarity to our reading, let's look at her treatment of romantic love. It is quite true that Hazzard accords love its proper weight, depicting the effect of love, or its absence, on individual lives, with a gravity and steeliness reminiscent of classical tragedy. Her treatment of the romantic paradigm is striking, however. For a start, Caro, who values and inspires love, is a powerful rather than typically passive female figure. She chooses badly when she falls in love with Paul, but has the strength to reject him when he doesn't live up to her standards of personal integrity. It is Ted, the male lead, who is denied agency in relation to love, who waits and hopes and suffers over years. And Ted is a highly atypical romantic hero. He isn't handsome or rich, and his name, Ted Tice, suggests a comic character rather than a matinee idol. The Transit of Venus marks its difference from the romantic novel in other ways too. Scandalously for the 1950s, Caro is sexually active outside marriage, as are other young women in the novel. And while the romantic novel typically ends with marriage, Hazzard keeps following her characters' lives and describes the betrayals and disappointments that attend less than happy unions. Grace's marriage illustrates the point, as does Ted's. Furthermore, if Caro's beauty is emphasized, so is her intelligence. She's placed first in her civil service exams, but as a woman is offered only an inferior appointment at a low salary. Hazzard is scathing, incidentally, about the lack of career opportunities for women in the 1950s and early 60s. And she's quietly insistent about women's need for intellectual stimulation throughout their lives. So after she marries a rich man, Caro has no need to earn her living, but she does. She continues to work as a translator. And of course, finally, the catastrophe that ends the Transit of Venus is the antithesis of the happy resolution required by romantic fiction. However, a novel that merely reversed or flouted romantic conventions would remain governed by them. Hazzard's critique of romantic love is more subtle and more systemic. While fully acknowledging the blessing of requited love, the love that Caro and Adam, for instance, enjoy, Hazzard also draws attention to the selfishness at the heart of romance. When Caro is under Paul's spell, she doesn't hesitate to betray Ted's secret to him. Similarly, Ted's love for Caro inflicts suffering on his wife. Romantic love is by definition antisocial. It is a rebellion of two. What Hazzard holds up as an alternative ideal is empathy, not romantic love, but a loving kindness that notices and tries wherever possible to alleviate suffering. This is the love Ted shows the German scientist, disinterested, instinctive, unhesitating. Another flashback describes Ted visiting Hiroshima with other scientists in 1946 to study the after effects of radiation. There he has, I quote, a revelation, nearly religious, that the colossal scale of evil could only be matched by some solitary flicker of intense and private humanity. Caro meets Adam, who campaigns for human rights, when he comes to London with 4 Latin Americans. They are there to plead for the lives of their countrymen, some political prisoners who are to be executed. The British government refuses to intercede, and the Latin Americans have to go away. Caro's thoughts follow these men into the cold street, a flicker of intense and private humanity. Later, when the prisoners are executed, Caro and Adam keep vigil for them on the other side of the world. A futile yet moving and compassionate gesture. The novel abounds in scenes like these, some significant, some trifling. Again and again, our attention is drawn to suffering, and we are invited to feel for the powerless and the defeated, for disabled First World War veterans begging in the streets of Sydney, for the survivors of Japanese death camps, for the victims of Hiroshima or the Blitz, for the Chileans murdered in the CIA-sponsored coup that overthrows the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende. Hazzard has said that history is central to the transit of Venus. The novel invokes conflicts across the globe and often does so in flashback, a formal device that inserts the past into the present of the narrative, deliberately disrupting its smooth flow, so that the joys and sorrows of individuals are in this way situated in a global context of violence and suffering to which the novel obsessively returns. Hardly the stuff of romantic fiction. You probably all know W.H. Auden's September the 1st, 1939. This is the poem that contains what has become one of Auden's most famous lines. We must love one another and die. We must love one another or die. Very soon after the poem was published, Auden began to distance himself from it. He omitted the stanza that contains that line from the version published in his collected poems. And he eventually rewrote it, as I just did, so that it finally reads, we must love one another and die. Although the earlier sentimental version, we must love one another or die, continues to circulate and is probably better known. Well, the transit of Venus seems to me a gloss on Auden's line in its revised, unflinching form. Characters who love one another, in the romantic sense, die. Lives are smashed by design or chance. And while flickers of private humanity are commended as our moral imperative, there is no pretense that they can prevent the colossal force of evil. You know, I think of that voyage that Hazzard made when she left Australia at the age of 16, just 2 years after the end of the Second World War. I think of that young girl, nourished on reading, joyfully anticipating the fabled places that she knew from books as her ship sailed out through Sydney Harbour. Elsewhere, she has wonderfully described that being on that ship and it approaching the coastline of Asia in the dark and seeing lights shining out in what she calls the Conradian ports. But what did she find on arrival? Wonders, of course, but also the still raw traces of a devastating world war. One of the places that schoolgirl visited on her voyage out was Hiroshima. The experience of being confronted with the aftermath of unimaginable catastrophe would find its fullest expression in Hazzard's next novel, The Great Fire, published in 2003. But it is already vividly present in The Transit of Venus, where the theatre of the world is a scorched place, in which suffering is always present and enacted on a global scale. I'm almost done, but I want to end with a confession. When I first read The Transit of Venus, I was actually underwhelmed. I was in my 20s then, and recently back in Australia, after a period when I had thought that I would make my life in France. I came to The Transit by way of Hazzard's first two books, The Evening of the Holiday and The Bay of Noon. These ravishing novels, both set in Italy, fed my nostalgia for Europe. I identified intensely with their young female protagonists, whose private dramas were lifted into grandness by the antique backgrounds against which they played out. The Transit of Venus, set mainly in the Anglophone world, seemed rather drab by comparison. I finished the book, put it aside, and forgot about it for 15 years. At the beginning of this century came Green on Capri, Hazzard's wonderful memoir about her long friendship with Graham Greene. As I slotted it into my bookshelves, my eye fell on The Transit of Venus. I took it down and, standing there in my living room, began to read. I remember the shock that came like a blow to the breastbone while I was still on the first page. But this is brilliant. This time I read the novel straight through with barely a pause, and I've reread it many times since. So what went wrong all those years ago? Armed with 2 degrees in literature and working towards the 3rd at the time, I considered myself a sophisticated reader. But novels speak to us directly and personally, or not at all. Nothing had equipped me to accept the resolute unsentimentality of Hazzard's vision in this novel, or to understand what she has to say about the power of time to transform and crush. I resisted the idea that the funfair would always turn out to be unfair. It's not a truth readily heard at 25. Among the reasons why I value The Transit of Venus is that it cautions me against mistaking the limits of my understanding for the limits of art. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for that fabulous speech, that lecture. And I'll say, just before I ask you a question, I'll just mention that we have the ushers at the sides. They have microphones if you do want to have a question. It's already almost 7 o'clock, so if you do want to put up your hand and ask a question and join in the conversation, feel free to do so. I wanted to pick up something you were saying just near the end. I was interested where you mentioned Hazzard's own boat journey, because it seems to me that boats are very important in this novel, aren't they? There's a lot of boat symbol. The parents die in a ferry accident, of course.
Yes.
But there are various modes at the last moment not the last, but the very late reunion between Ted Tice and Caro actually takes place on a boat too.
Yes, yes.
And how do you read that symbolism? I mean, I sort of saw it as being tied in with its being tragic, as you were talking about, as a symbol of death, perhaps the ferryman, that ominous atmosphere.
Gosh, isn't that clever? It completely passed me by, of course. Yes, indeed. Transport is, no pun intended, but hazardous in Hazard very often.
Cars are quite important too.
Cars are quite important.
What's her name? The Tertia Drage, the wife,
Yes.
has her car. There's a bit of a fuss made about her car early on as a kind of marker of her kind of class, I suppose.
Yes. But there are often, these disasters. The ferry, Caro and Grace's parents are killed in a ferry accident in Sydney. And then, of course, there's the famous plane crash. And planes crash. They crash in the Bay of Noon, they crash in this book, and they crash in the Great Fire. I mean, and I really wonder whether, of course, Hazzard, so at the age of 16, she goes to Japan and then very soon afterwards to Hong Kong, where she spends 2 years. And Hong Kong, of course, had a notoriously hazardous airport, landing strip where planes often did crash. And I was wondering whether whether she saw something happen, or it just, these crashing planes, there has to be a reason for that.
Yeah,
really.
well, I mean, it's
a good way of getting rid of surplus characters to us.
Well, yes.
Put them in a plane.
But the resistance to there's a certain ambivalence about modernity in Hazzard's work too. In fact, one of the quotes I have from her that I was going to put to you was one from I think it came from the Paris Review interview in 2005, where she actually suggested that The Transit of Venus was an anti-war novel. Do you see that as being? I mean, I think you mentioned it in terms of the kind of humanity, I suppose, of the resistance to that technological aspect.
I think it's deeply
my reading
anti-war.
that was very much in the background, but
Already? Oh no! I mean, I think what she said, that politics is central to the novel. In the present, she's talking about the coup in Chile, for instance, and then the Second World War is there in the background. But these characters' lives have all been marked so deeply.
I'll read what she said. The Transit of Venus is almost as much an anti-war novel as The Great Fire. Ted Tice goes to Hiroshima, and Caro and Grace are influenced from childhood by the horror of the Great War, the amputees and veterans of Gallipolian France, impoverished by the Great Depression, passing by on their annual commemoration through the streets of Sydney. Both novels testify in different ways to a world trying not to go to pieces under the burden of modern experience.
Yes, but I mean, I don't know that because she's anti-war that she's anti-modernity. Certain things like the position of women, she certainly welcomes. I mean, she's quite unillusioned about the way women are treated in the period she's writing about. So she, I think, would welcome wider opportunities for women in the modern world. I suppose where she's, I would say, you see it, and not so much anti-modernity, but a consumer culture, for instance. She describes Grace and Caro at school in Sydney in the 1940s after the war, and one of their schoolmates turns up, and she's got all this kind of,
there's actually a wonderful line.
It's a wonderful scene.
If I can find it.
This child has got all this wonderful sort of stuff that someone has brought her from America or something, and it's all it's kind of useless and irresistible. It's kind of pencils with coloured tips and flashy pencil sharpeners and
Here we go. Here it is. This is the line I was thinking of. They're unmoved by it, though. This is and the line is, having felt no lack, the girls could experience no envy.
No.
So they have, they're. It's almost like it's slightly pre-consumerism. So they're confronted with it, but why do I want this? It's tacky, it's trashy, so they kind of see through it.
Yeah.
And it's one of those marvellous lines that are all through the novel, which actually brings me to another thing I wanted to pick up from your speech about her style.
Yes.
And how deeply that informs her moralism. I mean, I think she's a moralist not in the sense of she's pushing a moral, but in the sense that she's a ruthless dissector and judger of her characters.
Yes, indeed.
And I mean, I've heard her work described as being sort of classicist, which I think, I'm not sure how apt a label that is, but it seems to me certainly it has some pretty strong affinities with more of a 19th century novelistic sensibility.
Yes. Yes, I mean, I think one of the things is that, when this novel was first published in 1980, it probably looked pretty old-fashioned then because of that strong moral grounding at a time when, everyone was kind of, being very experimental and cutting loose, and it was deeply unfashionable to
well, I guess sort of post Chekhov and so on, the narrators are meant to step back. Authors kind of refine themselves out of existence, but she's there. She's constantly
absolutely there.
And there's another thing I actually had marked and thought I might read, if you'll indulge me for a moment, is as an example of this is Tertia Drage.
Yes.
The way she introduces her character. Which is hilarious and completely ruthless. She says, Sefton Thrall comes in with her and says, I have Tertia with me. He had Tertia with him, the daughter of a lord, so sleekly pretty, so fair and tall that she seemed an advertisement for something very costly. She had driven a car from the castle, and her hair was bound with a strip of pink silk that passed behind her ears. Her eyes were light blue, shining with what at a distance passed for sheer delight, and perhaps in childhood had truly been. Up close, however, the clarity was stinging, and neither gave nor received a good impression. Nothing about her appeared to have been humanly touched. Which is completely as ruthless a character sketch as you can find. But she's actually not done with it. She goes on to say, Tertia Drage plucked a leaf from her dress and flung it emphatically in the empty grate. It was something they were to notice again in Tertia, that she handled objects or pushed doors with punitive abruptness, seeing no reason to indulge an uncompliant world. The occasional human anger felt against inanimate things that tumble or resist was, in her case, perpetual.
And, she's described as an advertisement for something costly. So, again, that kind of... her satire is expressed in terms of consumerism.
And her car, of course, which is great important. The symbolism, that symbolism that runs all the way through it, it's so tightly worked. I mean, you mentioned the scene with where Caro comes to the window wearing nothing but a watch.
Yes.
But the watch actually... it reoccurs all the way through. There's this in the very last scene in the boat.
Yes.
She actually takes off the watch, and there are several points, and there's a sense of it being in that moment of them escaping that historical pressure for a moment.
Yes.
That you spoke of it as being sort of resistant to. Some of the romantic cliches, but that moment is itself extremely romantic. It's almost like a removal from all those cares that have burdened them, just for that moment.
Yes, for a moment.
Temporarily.
Yes. Well, look, it's a novel that you can read, dozens of times and find new things, new meanings, always, I think, because it is just so densely written and so cleverly structured,
yes,
that circular structure.
And you mentioned too that kind of irony, that kind of self-consciousness, and there's an interesting, I think, interplay between that. that sense of coincidence and, you know, the idea of a structured novel, you know, which is, do you see that as being related to the tragedy? I mean, that sense of everything being...
predetermined, everything is, you know, there is no escape. There's this exchange between Ted and Caro right at the end, I think, which is sums this up, where she says, she actually asks him about the German. She says, you might meet the German again someday. Things come around so strangely. Well, actually, this is quite earlier on, and then it recurs. Ted says, I've thought that too. I thought there may be more collisions of the kind in life than in books. Maybe the element of coincidence is played down in literature because it seems like cheating or can't be made believable, whereas life itself doesn't have to be fair. It doesn't have to be believable.
Or convincing.
Yes.
And it seems to me one of the interesting things about this book is it's full of coincidences. People are constantly bumping into each other accidentally, but never, in no sense do you get that
it's
sense
false.
that it's contrived or it's strange or unusual. You know, people do bump into people.
Yes, well, that is because she's a genius.
I knew there was a reason.
Answer to that.
We've only got about 5 more minutes. Does anyone have any questions? Just do stick your hand up. We have some people with microphones at the side. If anyone does have a question for Michelle.
Thank you, Michelle. It was wonderful. Simple question. Have you met Shirley Hazzard?
No, I haven't.
Do you yearn to?
I do indeed yearn to, but...
And part B, what would you like to discuss for 15 minutes with her?
Oh, gosh. I would ask her about poetry, I think, about her favourite poems, because, you know, she has reams of poetry off by heart, and I would want to know which poems she read when she was a girl, and what she remembers and what she values. So that's what I would ask her about, I think.
Thanks, Michelle. I thought that was a fantastic talk. I was just wondering what you thought about Shirley Hazzard's attitude towards Australians and being like an expat who goes away, if you like, and doesn't return. Do you think she has positive attitudes in general about Australia, or what?
Yeah, well, it is a bit of a theme in the book. There's a bit of a passage about Australian history in there.
Yes, there is. But you know, well, here, but you know, Caro, who is one of the very sort of sympathetic characters in the novel, is of course Australian, and Antipodean vision is clarity. Look, I think if I could be allowed a personal note here, Hazzard left Australia when she was 16. I left Sri Lanka when I was 14, and I would say that she is as Australian as I am Sri Lankan, which is to say deeply and not at all. I mean, both those things are kind of true, really. She always writes as an outsider, Hazzard, and that is her Australianness coming through in her work, I think, whether or not she's actually writing about Australians. When she came back here in 1984, I think it was, to deliver the Boyer lectures, she made some critical remarks about Australia. She emphasised how much things had changed since she had lived here, how she found the country transformed, sort of improved out of sight, and it was a new and exciting place. But she made some critical remarks about, she said something like, given the wealth and in Australia, one would have hoped that Australians would make more of a mark on the world, or something like that. Well, that is the remark that is remembered and held against her, naturally. I think she often has written and spoken really positively about Australia. And actually, in the transit, there's a little moment, a tiny moment, that Grace says something like, I would like to go back one day, and someone says, why? And she says, to see what I couldn't see when I was young.
Yes, it's quite near the end too.
Really near the end. So it's after Adam has died, and she's wondering what to do with her life. So You know,
Yeah.
that's
I mean,
my
I think in the
answer.
novel she's making some symbolic use of that
Yeah.
old world and new world. In fact, one of the sections of the 4 sections, 2 are called Old World and New World.
Yes.
And it's very much a kind of cosmopolitan novel that shifts from
Yes.
England to the US and Australia and so on. And she makes symbolic use of the landscape, the greenness of England as opposed to the rather more arid landscape of Australia. And in a certain sense, that's a kind of received
Yeah.
trope. But in that, in that Paris Review interview I cited earlier, she also does emphasise the point that older view of Australia not having the kind of depth of culture is, in certain respects, passé. That it's
Yes.
things have changed.
Yes, she does make that point over and over, I think. But,
Lest
anyway.
she be
Yes.
misunderstood. I think we are going to have to wrap it up. I'm sorry about that. We could probably take a few more questions, but unfortunately there is another event, so we do have to end there. So will you please join with me in thanking Michelle de Kretser?
And thank James. Thank you. Thanks.